Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
And you do describe the local people there in the association in colourful terms.
The associations have a lot of power because they can determine your fate as an MP. So you constantly have to be nice to them. And sometimes you just think, oh, shut the f*** up. Do you know what I mean? Like, go away.
I'm Christopher Hope, the chief political correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. And this is Chopper's Politics. Scenes from Kabul airport are rightly dominating the bulletins this week, with US President Joe Biden rejecting calls to extend the August 31st deadline for US forces to leave. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the sudden Taliban takeover with Dominic Nicholls, our defence and security editor, who served for 23 years in the British Army, and with Lucy Fisher, our deputy political editor. They have both spent time in Afghanistan and give different perspectives on this war-torn country. And with US President Joe Biden in the news about the US handling of the crisis in Kabul, we'll be asking a question that many people are thinking. Is he too old to lead the free world? But first, something a little different. Now, political diaries are part and parcel of the Westminster scene, and normally they are kept by the MPs themselves. But last year, a diary emerged from an unexpected quarter. Sasha Swire, wife of Sir Hugo Swire, a former Foreign Office minister, published her thoughts and recollections on the time when David Cameron and Theresa May ran the country. And the book is completely brilliant. Diary of an MP's Wife, Inside and Outside Power has now racked up tens of thousands of sales. That's a lot for a non-fiction political book. It was an account of politics seen through the eyes of someone who isn't a politician themselves. And it was so gripping that it kept me from my John le Carrés I had bought specially for my staycation in Cornwall this year. Such was the storm that Sasha Swire has kept her head down for months since the book was published, until today, when she joins us on Chopper's Politics. Sasha Swire, welcome to Chopper's Politics. It's great to have you here in the studio.
Thank you.
You're the author of Diary of an MP's Wife, Inside and Outside Power, and I can completely recommend it. I bought it for my holidays, and it stopped me reading John le Carré. That's how good it is. Now, that's a big deal
well
for me.
thumbed, I must say.
It's well thumbed, I'll say. It's on the beach. They're a triumph. I think they work because of their honesty. Do you regret that honesty?
No, absolutely not. I'm very anti-establishment, like my father is. So no, I think good diaries have to be honest. I mean, I'm a bit naughty. I mean, I probably shouldn't have published them, but I don't care. I just need to slightly explain that when I wrote this, I did not write it for publication. So I just went to my desk to write about things that amused me the night before. I never wrote the night of happenings. I was usually too drunk to sort of. But I'd go to bed and I'd rage around. I'd have brain race on who said what and whatever. And then I'd go to the desk in the morning.
Is that really true? You weren't planning to publish it? Because it is so well written and it is so funny. You have to, at some point, I mean, I'm holding a book here, the well-thumbed book from my holiday, 510 pages long. At some point you thought, this is going to get published because I'm writing a lot of words here.
So I've written about 1 million words. This was 500,000. This decade was 500,000 words. And gosh, I don't know how many words. It's 500 pages or something.
But the point is, there's a lot
more. But it was
more
shrunk down. Yes,
it's
a quarter of what I threw at the editor. So, I mean, I never read back anything I write. So I said, you decide. In fact, a sort of editor's job is more difficult than a writer's job because you have to make those decisions of what to keep and what not to keep.
Legal things.
So we'll go on to legal things. But I mean, so ultimately, I think people always have to remember that publishers are commercial organisations. So, they're going to edit it in a way that appeals to the reader. Did I write it for the reader? I certainly didn't. I just wrote what amused me. But it is extraordinary at the moment is that I'm sort of being touted as this sort of that I've written history and everything, which is I find extraordinary.
You're the Alan Clark of the
well,
2020.
People say that. I mean, I think it's a way of putting me in a genre, but of course I'm nothing like Alan Clark, so I'm not as lustful.
Well, you're better than Alan Clark, I would say. I totally agree with my friend Gabby Hinsliff, who says, imagine if Jane Clark had written Alan Clark's diary and how good that would be. And that is what you've done here. You've done it as this kind of person engaged with politics, who cares and loves politics, but you're slightly one step removed, but you're in the room, or you're half in the room because you're your husband, Hugo, and we'll come to it later, is in the room. But you're kind of there, and it makes it a better diary, I think.
I mean, I'm not Alan Clark, 'cause I'm not a man. That's the key thing, and I'm not a politician. I think the interesting factor about it is that I'm a woman, and I think very few political diaries have been written by women. So I think Barbara Castle wrote a diary, but it was very much for public service. She wanted to show what she'd done in government and everything.
Cement her legacy.
Yes, cement her legacy. And Edwina Currie, and I haven't read Edwina Currie's, but according to Ian Dale, who's quite a good political pundit, I mean, he says they're very good. But I think you do get dismissed slightly.
As a woman?
Yeah, as a woman.
Or as a plus one?
As a wife, as a plus one. You know, you're talked over a lot. And they're not expecting you. I mean, the one thing that I say to a lot of MPs' wives now, I said, I've just made your life so much better because everyone now, no one is going to talk over you. They're going to think, is she writing a diary? Or,
Good for you. And you call out being talked over in the book, don't you?
Yes, I do a lot.
And that's
I do
great,
a lot.
actually.
Yeah. But I mean, when they were trying to, people like you, horrible hound dogs like you.
Oh, come on.
I'm
a nice one.
Trying to dig around and find stuff about me. No one could find anything because I was so sort of, I mean, the hardcore lot, you know, like...
Well, you're John Nott's daughter, who many older listeners remember being a Defence Secretary during the Falklands War. What does he think about this?
He loves it.
Does he?
Well, because he's in it quite a lot, maybe.
Yes.
No, but he absolutely do it. My father is very anti-establishment, and he likes to shake up all the ridiculousness around protocol, around royalty, and, you know, I mean, he's very sort
Love
of,
it.
I suppose, I am quite like him, I think. I mean, I am his daughter.
Let me talk about Hugo. The book starts with "To Hugo, sorry!" exclamation mark. Now, you have actually, you know, he's told you stuff of that the night before from his chats in the lobby with Nick Soames or somebody, and you put it into your diary the next day. I mean, he said at one point towards the end of the 10 years you cover, 2010 to 2019, he says, if you publish this diary, I'm going to resign. But how has he reacted to this book?
It was a huge sort of media storm when it happened, and I really wasn't expecting that.
That was last October it came out. It was in a national newspaper.
Well, I think when the extracts came out, and I think the extracts were a bit sensationalised, as they always are. So I think the trouble is he didn't really know the extent of what I'd written, and he only really saw it when the proofs came back at us. And I did say to him at the time, I said, look, you know, he said, well, you can never publish this. You know, I mean, not that he'd read it, but he said, you can't ever publish it. You know, it's a complete betrayal of our friendships and whatever. And I said, look, we'll just get it down and then we'll decide later. And then, of course, when the proofs did come, I let him go through them and take out everything that he wanted to take out. So, I mean, but it was still quite tricky.
It's a great book.
It was still.
So did David Cameron really say he wanted to push you into bush and give you one?
He did say that. I mean, he'll probably deny it. But I just want to say one thing, which I have to get very straight here, is that it was a walk along the Southwest Coastal Path, and his wife was walking beside me, and 3 security men, and my husband.
She heard that.
But I mean, the point is that if he was going to shove me in the bushes, it would have been quite tricky.
Yes,
because
gorse bushes like that. Yes, I know there's bushes.
There's gorse bushes, yeah. So it was a joke. It was very much a joke. It wasn't very serious.
The balls. Now he's the. I mean, Erdogan, for listeners who don't remember, was Chief of Staff to David Cameron at the time.
Yes, he was.
Why are you grabbing by the balls?
I mean, they were all quite used to me being quite ballsy as a character, so maybe that wasn't too much of a shock for him. But no, that was a terribly bad thing to do.
Yes, but
absolutely shocking.
He wouldn't. I know him a bit. He wouldn't mind, and it was at a party, and the context.
I think he must have been irritating me, and you know, the one way to get men is to cut their balls off, isn't it? It's what I did to my dog.
While we're staying below waistline, now you do describe Michael Gove's manhood as like a slinky on a stair, like a slinky spring. How do you know he's got a slinky?
Well, that's a very good question, because my husband, came out of my husband's mouth. So I want to know is how my husband knows the size of Michael Gove's male member. I'm not going to ask any questions on that. But the slinky, I mean, apparently the sales on Amazon went through the roof.
Slinkies.
And everyone was Googling what slinky
I'm looking at my producer, Louisa. Do you know what a slinky is, Louisa? No, it's one of those metal things that falls downstairs.
Ahead of you.
Goes uncoils as his trousers drop. But let's just leave that thought.
Yes, I have no idea about Michael Gove's slinky. I absolutely
but
promise
he's interviewing you, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
At a future book festival. So I think you need a challenge.
Which is very generous of him.
I love the characters in it. I mean, Hugo Swire, towards the end of his time in Parliament, he was the campaign manager for Dominic Raab. You call him Raab seen Brexit, which I loved. You call Theresa May Old Ma May. Matt Hancock is called Hand on Cock. and John Hayes is called Shrek. I think you do right. You do find great characters, and you don't need to know the characters to enjoy the way you're describing people.
Yeah, I mean, I think characters are very important to a diarist. And I mean, I literally sit by my Daily Telegraph waiting for the dom shells to fall.
That's Dominic Cummings.
That's Dominic Cummings. Because he's such a big character. So for a diarist, it's just absolutely marvellous. I mean, the big characters during the time that my husband was in politics was obviously Gove, was George Osborne. Cameron less so, but he was Prime Minister, so he was a character. Yeah. And, I just love... I mean, they're very colourful, these people, and I just think they give diaries. And you see a lot of legacy books don't put in that colour or, it's very black and white, a sort of legacy.
And his book was no good. I mean, David Cameron's book didn't sell that well, and it was quite wooden. I think he was basically trying to put down what happened to him, and it became a bit of a treatise rather than an actual chatty book, which he's more of a relaxed person, isn't he?
Yes, but I think it's absolutely the duty of a Prime Minister to put down his perspective.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, I don't think he did it for sales, It was just to get his story across, and I think all Prime Ministers do that.
But the stories were so good. I mean, the Dominic Raab looking sweaty like he wanted to kill you. I mean, and when he
does have that throbbing temper. I'm a huge fan of Dominic Raab. I think he's rather stiff on television.
He needs to relax a bit.
He needs to relax a bit, but I think he's a really decent person. He's got a great backstory, and I think he's very serious.
But you know the Raabs quite well, don't you, Sasha Swire? And you were tweeting this week about Dominic Raab being unfairly picked on in a breakfast TV advert about his holiday and whether he was in a water or under a cabana or not.
Yes. I mean, I think that's all very unfair. I think the idea that Dominic Raab wasn't working flat out, in his hotel room, it's just absurd to think he wasn't doing that. I mean, it was very fast moving, and he's very focused on his job and work. And I just think it's reducing the most important story of to a sunbed.
That's the media, isn't it?
Come on, let's treat these people with respect.
And in the book, I was struck by Hugo when he was a long-serving Middle East minister or foreign minister. But no one ever says thank you. And
no one says thank you.
Someone did say thank you, didn't they? In about October 2019.
I think the Queen said thank you to him when he was knighted. And I thought that was just a really nice thing to say.
And he was very moved by that. And I thought...
I mean, his association didn't send him a thank you letter.
Yeah, but someone did there. And someone in the association said thank you, I think, in the book. I thought it was interesting that saying thank you to people who give their time. I
just think it's polite.
No one says thank you,
do you know what I mean? No one says thank you anymore. It's amazing, isn't it?
But maybe we should be nicer about people like Hugo Swire, who did eschew money in the private sector to try and do something for the betterment of this country.
I think it's bad that I mean a lot of people who go into politics don't do it for the sort of the vanity or the glory. They go in it to help their constituents. And I wasn't a politician. I have to keep reminding people. So I was there when they were switched off. So
they relaxed.
They relaxed. And people like you, it's like this. They press their noses up against the glass
screen
window.
In the Telegraph studio. But I can't get past that screen, but you're behind.
So in a way, I'm a sort of Trojan horse. So I do get inside, and I think it is quite. I mean, I say that in the preface. It's every now and then it's important to get inside and see who these people are and what makes them.
Do you felt they loved power too much?
No, but sometimes, yes.
For its own sake, as opposed to serving the country and the rest of it.
I don't think you get very far in politics if you don't have interests. So I think even if you are interested in power, Gove was interested in education, and Andrew Mitchell in overseas development, or you do develop. You push your interests. But of course, power is very corrupting, and you suddenly are surrounded by interesting people, which most people's daily lives are not. And yes, you. I mean, I think you were one of these people who did the expenses scandal, and I
that made you cross, didn't it?
No, it didn't make me cross. I tell you what, because it was fair enough. It was good journalism and everything. But I think the great tragedy of the expense scandal was that it split families up. So when we went into politics, the expenses covered a place in the constituency. And now, as a family, you're split. So
it still does, though, doesn't it? You still can.
Yes, but not really. I mean, you basically have a one-bedroom flat or you stay in a hotel in London. So you leave your family in one place. And that didn't happen. You sort of either shifted your family with you. And I think that's quite dangerous for sort of men sitting alone in London by themselves.
I think men are bad on their own. I agree with that entirely.
Bad on their own. So I think that was a fallout from the expenses, which I think affected many marriages. Because also men come to I don't know women, but they come to London and they suddenly think they're terribly important. And there's quite a lot of predatory females around politics, and then they think so the wife doesn't change really. She's still the same wife with the same kids.
You touched in retrospect on your own marriage actually, and you talked how Dave and Sam Cam said, "Come and stay. We'll talk it over every weekend in Chequers." But you didn't really dwell on that at all. And how have you found that you've got Hugo back now, haven't you? He's yours again from the.
I'm not sure I'm liking
the red. Well, no, but the red box owned him, and now he's back from that.
I mean, I think we have a very good marriage. I mean, we've been married for 25 years, I think, and I can't remember how long it is, but we've had our ups and downs, and I think it was particularly tricky when he was a Foreign Office Minister because he was never at home and he was exhausted. People think it's terribly glamorous, but you literally sort of get in a car at the airport and you get out of a car and you come into a room like this and you don't even know where you are in the world.
The meetings they're in, or the rooms they're in, interchangeable.
All around the world. And the funny thing is you have to be over 9 or 10 hours to even sit in business class.
That's right. That's the FCO rules.
Yes, it's something like that. So it can be incredibly uncomfortable. You've got jet lag. Then you come home and your wife says, take out the rubbish.
And you hoped, I'm sure every political partner hopes that their other partner will get a job in cabinet, and it never came to him, did it?
No, it didn't. Hoping... But there's no fairness in politics. If I'm not,
was he a man too posh? Old Etonian?
I think he was too
posh.
I think he was too posh, and I think if there was a non-public school leader, he probably would have done. But I think it was all a bit too close to the bone. I mean, David gives a different version of that, but if I publish earlier diaries, I'll give the true version.
He's been very generous about the book, isn't he, I think? I mean, he is exposed as the private picture of David Cameron, but he did say, look, I'm a public figure, and he seems a bit kind of...
Well, he's all right. I mean, he's in contact with my husband, so,
Still talking to you?
But I never had that sort of text relationship with David, so, I mean, they were the big friends. I mean, I was the sort of byproduct, as I keep saying.
And I love when you talked about how, you're on duty as ministers, and there's one thing where David Cameron was there and you had Hugo Swire there, and David gave this kind of private signal, come on, buck up, let's get through this together. This kind of... Because, they are friends as well as on duty,
they are friends. I mean, you don't have many friends in politics, really, because it's...
Well, I would say David Cameron definitely has friends and Boris Johnson doesn't.
I think Boris doesn't have friends. I think that's absolutely right. I think he has women, so to speak. So whoever his current woman is.
His wife.
His wife now.
It's got to be fair on
but
this.
I mean, during his political... I'm talking over
the piece,
decade.
over 30 years,
They're very much his wives or his girlfriends are very much his sounding boards. So I think that's... He really likes women, Boris, I mean, we all know he likes women, but I think he actually respects women.
You described a really interesting dinner at Number 10. I think it may be in November or October 2019.
I all the stories he brings up,
When you called him, you said he's unhappy and lonely on the inside.
Yeah, I mean,
this is Boris Johnson.
I don't know Boris really well because, like you said, he is a bit of an island. Everyone thinks they know Boris, but they don't really. I just got that impression. Look, it might be the wrong impression, but it was certainly my impression. I mean, as a diarist, it's like a journalist or interviewing someone. You have to make an instant decision quite quickly about who that person is, and sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. But you're quite alert to anything,
But you're very sympathetic to him politically, weren't you? Because you're a raging Brexiteer.
No, I wasn't a raging Brexiteer because I voted Remain, actually.
Did you?
Yes.
It wasn't clear in the book.
No, I voted Remain.
But you became a Brexiteer then after the vote?
I very much became a Brexiteer in the sense that, I wouldn't define myself as a Brexiteer, but I just thought that...
Honour the vote.
Honour the vote. That was my main thing. So
you're a Democrat then?
I was appalled by what was going on in Parliament. In fact, both Hugo and I were, and all the plotting behind the scenes. And it was, I hate talking about Brexit. I absolutely hate it. But I mean,
we used to a lot on this podcast. We don't anymore.
But it was a Remain Parliament, and they were with a Remain speaker, and I think it was just exhausting. And my attitude is very much in politics, if you don't apply the loser's consent, you get into all kinds of trouble. So yes, they'll say, the Remainers might say, yes, but it was 58, whatever. I can't remember what
48.
Yeah, 50, 48 or whatever. And I said, well, so what? they still won. You have to respect that.
And you fell out with friends. I mean, Amber Rudd used to describe that. Amber, I can't even talk to you.
No.
Until you stop trying to undermine that vote.
Yes, I mean, I think Amber, we were very much on the opposite sides there. And I was just slightly worried. We used to see each other once a week or something and just sort of mull over politics and things. And I just thought, well, let's just give it a sort of break. Because I didn't want to have a fight, really. But it was quite difficult because everyone I knew in that sort of group were ardent Remainers, and I wasn't really approving of that.
You're now one of the diarists of your generation. Are you keeping a diary now?
Yes, of course I am. I shall write about you today.
This will be in a diary, this difficult journalist you met at the Telegraph. Will you publish them and will you keep going?
I really don't know. I mean,
Ali Campbell's on volume 6, I think. We had him on recently.
Yes, I found this very, very traumatic. I mean, I just wasn't expecting it to... I'm actually quite a private person, which is quite embarrassing to say and hypocritical. I'm sorry to say, you kind of exploded last October when it came out. Yeah, I did. It was just really weird.
People didn't know you as a political spouse at all. You weren't really out there. We knew Hugo, but even in politics terms, I knew Hugo as
very low profile.
Close to David. You've had definitely low profile. But if you're a Foreign Office minister, you're never in Parliament. So basically, he was never around where I was.
And so he was Northern Ireland before that. So he was always in exile.
Yes.
I don't wonder why.
But it meant, he was always never quite...
But I mean, I think he was in the Foreign Office for 4 years. It was a long time. And he had sort of 3/4 of the world as a brief. So, he really was flying here, there and everywhere.
You have a house in Devon, don't you?
I do,
Chatham,
yes.
Which you talk about. And you do describe the local people there in the association, in colourful terms, a bit like the Archers, I felt, these characters.
Or Vicar of Dibley, someone said.
Yeah, but you also, I think, probably to preserve your relationship with them, you did say, but they are lovely people, but they have these different...
They are lovely.
They've forgiven
I think
you
one
for
or
it.
two were a little bit upset, but I don't really have any regrets about that. We spent 20 years, I spent 20 years buttoning my lip. It's quite, people coming up to say, you've done this wrong, you should behave like this. I mean, in an earlier diary as a wife, I was told that I shouldn't wear open-toed shoes and that I should wear more jewellery because I didn't look like an MP's wife. So, no, I don't regret. I think a lot of diaries don't cover the local associations or the constituency element. And sometimes local politics is far more...
It's the bread and butter.
Yeah, it's the bread and butter. It's a really important aspect of an MP's life.
Also, the most important. I'll argue the most important. Most of the time.
And the associations have a lot of power because they can determine your fate as an MP. So you constantly have to be nice to them. And sometimes you just think, oh, shut the up. Do you know what I mean? Like, go away, stop shoving pieces of paper into my husband's pocket. Do you know what I mean? But I am very fond of them. We're fond of all of them, particularly the stalwarts who actually came out. There are a lot of people in associations, they sort of sit and give you their views, but they don't actually, when election time comes, they don't help, which is the whole point.
Well, they're old, aren't they? They're ancient.
They're old and they're old, But I am very fond of the people who did help and the group around Hugo who supported Hugo. And
how is he now? I mean, how is Sir Hugo Swire at the moment?
He's Sir Hugo Swire. Oh, that's nice.
Well, you're Lady Swire.
I know I am. It's so funny. I completely forget. And it's quite grand, isn't it? I must use it more often. But no, he's fine. He's very cheerful. He's doing sort of different things.
Are you missing? You're not missing.
No, not at all. Not for
your time. I think your time was then. It was then, and now it's moved on, and that's quite nice to have that bookend.
I mean, I'm still a bit of a political junkie, and I still look at the news and read the columns and things. But I'm not. Your time exactly. You move on. You're in a different space. I think you can, and I certainly had reached that level, and I think Hugo had too, that you become terribly cynical. It also becomes cyclical. So, you're seeing the same thing go round and round again.
Well, I find that in political journalism, the same stories on a cycle.
I think you do get very cynical and you start seeing the absurd, not the good in it. And I think at that point you should go out. And I'm always amazed. I mean, I can name about 5 of them. I just can't believe why they're still in there, just go out and my father did that, he did a second career and everything. And I think it's really important not to hang around too long.
Well, we can't let you hang around too long this podcast. Sasha Swire, the author of Diary of an MP's Wife, Inside and Outside Power, available in paperback now for £9.99 from Little Brown. I can totally recommend it to every listener. Hope you enjoy it, as I have. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
And a link to Diary of an MP's Wife by Sasha Swire will be in the show notes for this episode. Now do stay with us for a change in tone as we discuss the Afghan crisis with 3 senior Telegraph writers. Right after this.
Hi listeners, I'm Claire Cohen, the Telegraph's women's editor, and the host of another podcast that might be just up your street. Even saying that gives me imposter syndrome. But that's what the show's all about. If you've ever had that niggling feeling that you don't belong in the room, that you feel a bit like a fraud and could be found out at any moment, this one's for you. Over 6 episodes on my podcast Imposters, I meet a woman at the top of her game and find out how she defeated self-doubt to get there.
I've been conditioned to think that I should be at the bottom of the hierarchy ladder, and therefore it's a miracle that I'm even where I am. Let's give myself credit for that.
I'm not someone who walks into a room with entitlement. I never have.
You can either choose to live in fear, or you can think, how can I make the best of today? And that's a conscious choice.
You can find it by clicking on the link in the episode description or search Imposters wherever you're listening to this.
From Westminster's political salons to Kabul and the unimaginable nightmare for thousands of Afghans trying to flee the Taliban. Dominic Nicholls is a former soldier and the Telegraph's defence editor who got to know Afghanistan very well during his time as an officer in the British Army. And Lucy Fisher is our deputy political editor who has reported from the country, giving a different perspective on the region and its people. Dominic Nicholls and Lucy Fisher, welcome to Choppers Politics. Now, Dom, before you were the Telegraph's defence editor, you served as a soldier. Just briefly describe your service to us, please.
Thanks for having me on. Yes, I was a soldier for 23 years. Originally started in tanks in the cavalry, messed around with horses for a bit, then went flying, flew helicopters, commanded an Air Corps squadron there. And I was in Afghanistan a number of times, but my last tour was in 10-11 with 16 Air Assault Brigade on Herrick 13.
Have the TV images from Kabul this week brought back difficult memories for you?
Shocking, tragic images, tragic memories. Just been kind of numb, really, watching the breaking news over the last 10 days since the Taliban took over. It's just an awful, awful humanitarian disaster, and I think it's going to get worse. So it's pretty shocking to watch, to be perfectly honest.
Do you think that what you're seeing out there now, you're seeing the Taliban militia standing over paras at Kabul airport, has that made the efforts, the sacrifice of you and your mates worth it? Have you questioned why you were there?
I've not questioned why we were there. The military is a problem-solving organisation. It tries to solve whatever the problem is that's given to it by the politicians. Now, you might know that ultimately and strategically, the politics were wrong in Kabul. The West took its eye off Afghanistan. We subcontracted the problem to the military and didn't work on the politics, the economy, and all the other investment, the infrastructure, as we should do. But ultimately, the military does what it can do with the problem it has in front of it. So, no, I don't think it was in vain. It's like saying to somebody, a relative of somebody who was killed in the Second World War, so, well, it's okay, isn't it? Because, we won the war. Well, of course, it's not okay. It's still got the tragic loss. There is a slight disconnect between the feelings of loss for friends and comrades from whether or not the mission was ultimately worth it. I don't think soldiers really think in that way and sort of directly link one to the other. Ultimately futile, because the Taliban are now in control, but that's not to negate the efforts and the value of those efforts for people who were there and those who didn't make it back.
Do you think back to the Afghans you met out there, Dom Nicholls, the interpreters, maybe the fixers, I don't know which local people you met, but those are the people who are now feeling very much abandoned, aren't they?
They are, and as I've written in the Telegraph and made a film for, I am really concerned that the way we exit this campaign could set the conditions for failure in the next one. If we don't live up to our moral standards here with the people who stood by us, then who is going to help us next time? There's talk of British Army going to Somalia. We're already in Mali, and these all need interpreters, fixers, contractors, locally employed civilians. Who on earth is going to volunteer their services if they look back and see the shameful way that we're treating many people who helped us? Now, I'm glad to see that thousands of the people who helped us in Afghanistan are making it out with their families, but some are going to be left behind. And if we don't do right by them in the long term, then how on earth can we expect people to come and volunteer for us in the future?
Now, Lucy Fisher, you went to Afghanistan twice as a defence correspondent. What did you see there?
Well, Chopper, I first went in October 2014 with David Cameron, in fact, while covering politics. And I went again in 2018 with Gavin Williamson while I was a defence editor at the Times. And one thing that's really stayed with me during that second trip was a visit to Camp Karga, where the Afghan National Army Officer Academy, nicknamed Sandhurst in the Sand, was based. And just meeting many of the recruits there, it was just a really stark difference between the type of cadet you'd meet at the real Sandhurst in Berkshire, incredibly sort of fit and strong men and women looking smart, disciplined in their uniforms, with essentially just incredibly, often quite lanky, sort of scruffy looking blokes, but people who told me that their fathers, their uncles had been killed by the Taliban, and they were just determined to be part of a new Afghanistan and to serve with the Afghan National Forces. And I was just so struck by their courage and determination to be part of the security forces protecting the state. And I've thought often of what's happened to those men. Also worth mentioning that at ANOA, this Sandhurst in the Sand Academy, were the first female cadet officers. And interestingly, trying to persuade women to join the Afghan National Forces in Afghanistan, where, traditional, village culture has persisted for a long time. Many people not accustomed to the idea of women working, let alone serving in an army. They had to pay the women more than men. But again, I was fascinated to learn about the women that had signed up, many of whom were widows and many of whom had children. And again, as the country has, crumbled into the hands of the Taliban, my thoughts have been with those women and men this week.
Dom Nicholls, were you surprised, following what Lucy Fisher's saying there about Joe Biden's comments that the Afghan army were not protecting themselves, so why should we? But given the fact that they were trying to train an army from a standing start with people physically who were just getting into being a soldier, were the remarks a bit unfair?
I think they were unfair. I think they were pretty unguarded, to be honest. They were fairly, very emotive language. I was quite surprised to hear him say that. I mean, the leadership of the Afghan National Security Forces, you could question that point where leadership meets politics. But for the sacrifice of the men and women on the ground, they had nearly 70,000 killed. I mean, you can't dispute that. You can dispute their tactics and their military efficiency, but you can't dispute them being there and taking their chances in the fight. I was very surprised by Joe Biden's comments, I have to say.
I should say that before we carry on, we're interviewing our team around the country, and I think Dom Nicholls is on the south coast by some squawking ducks, but we'll carry on. Lucy Fisher, were you surprised too? You think that Joe Biden was being unfair there? I mean, he's being driven by a political imperative, isn't he, to get out of Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Dom. I was surprised to hear him say that. It's certainly not what I saw on the ground, which was that people who were making great sacrifices, they want to be part of a new Afghanistan. They had often been personally affected by the Taliban, and yet they were going that mile to serve in the Afghan National Forces at risk to their own families. You wonder what those people will be thinking now about the choices they've made. As Dom says, will the West be able to coax local people to be allied in any future conflict based on the way we're walking away right now in Afghanistan?
Dom, I wonder if you're in touch with any of your colleagues out in Afghanistan. Are they in touch with you as a WhatsApp group? Are you hearing any real-time information from the ground on how hard it is at Kabul airport?
I am hearing real-time information, and I've had to rely on that quite heavily because there's been not an awful lot coming out of our government, unlike take what you will from it, but the Pentagon have been doing daily press conferences. That's something that we could have done with over here. Yeah, I mean, the message I'm getting from the ground is one of absolute chaos. The process, the actual sort of email process of registering seems to be working okay, and the Foreign Office staff and the Home Office and border agencies doing a great job in actually calling forward the right people. But then there's being told, right, you're on the list, make your way to the airport, and then getting through that scrum, the massive scrum at the gates, which is virtually impossible. So yes, I'm hearing from people on the ground that it's going well up to a point, but then there's the very obvious factor that they just simply can't get near. You've got these checkpoints, you've got the Taliban holding the first checkpoint after the Western forces, and the checkpoints thereafter are held by other members of the Taliban. But of course, we make the mistake of thinking it's one homogenous group. The Taliban is not, of course. It's a variety of competing interests and different gangs, basically. And there are some that are not part of this, not that I completely believe it for one moment, but not part of this, the shiny new Taliban 2.0. And there's reports of people taking bribes at checkpoints and all sorts. So it's a very, very chaotic situation. I feel completely helpless here. I've done what I can to try and connect people to sources of information, but there's virtually nothing I can do over here.
Lucy Fisher, how do you think, on the politics of this, which you're covering for the Telegraph this week, how do you think this has left our special relationship, in quotes, with America?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And essentially, it feels pretty badly damaged. Boris Johnson made no secret of the fact, really, that, the UK was seeking an extension to the August 31st deadline that the White House imposed on the evacuation efforts, saying that that's the last point at which they would be willing to stay in Afghanistan. And of course, it's not easy. The Taliban had said that that was the exit point deadline that must be honoured. But the efforts of UK and France to seek to negotiate that were rebuffed by Joe Biden this week. And really, it just feels that all throughout this, beginning with Donald Trump, then as Joe Biden took over, the US has been acting in an incredibly unilateral way, making its own decisions. And I think from that point, we really have to look very hard at ourselves in the UK. And the question has to be asked about how reliant we have become on the US and whether potential impotence without US support is something that needs to be redressed. We've just had this big defence review, the integrated review. That indeed is also predicated on the strength of the special alliance, our place in NATO, which is the cornerstone of defence in this country. It feels that it's a slightly weaker alliance in the wake of the events of the past 10 days.
Do you think Theresa May was right last week, Lucy Fisher, to say this is a failure of global Britain? Post-Brexit, Britain could have maybe led a NATO force in Afghanistan outside of the US's influence? Or is that completely impossible given the state of the defence budget today?
No, I think the rot set in long before that. I don't think it was ever feasible for the UK really to step up and take a leadership role in any kind of military or even sort of security assistance force in Kabul without the US. We have become so reliant on them. We do what we do very well. We have, for example, absolutely world-leading special forces who are often inserted into places to do their thing. They even rely often on US for logistics, for transport, for surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, and so forth. We cannot do very much without the US. Ben Wallace made clear that the UK had spoken to other NATO partners about the possibility of staying beyond the US departure, but there just was no appetite. I think a sense of pragmatism and realism set in.
And just finally, Dom, do you think the last few weeks in Afghanistan may have strained relations between armed forces and their political masters? So welcome.
I don't know. I hope it's given a dose of realism, i.e. that political masters will now realise the full implications of these decisions and that those at the top of the military tree are really able to speak truth to power and say, if you want to do this, Prime Minister, then these are the implications and these are the likely costs. I think the current crop of senior officers are able to do that. I think they've got the moral centre to do that. Whether or not that message lands well with ambitious politicians who look for a role on the world stage and are told, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that, and we can do that with the Americans and the French and some others if they turn up. I'm not sure how many politicians would want to hear that. That might strain the relationship.
Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph defence editor, Lucy Fisher, our deputy political editor. Thanks both for joining us this week on Chopper's Politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Chopper.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be with you.
Now, the United States' response to the Kabul crisis has meant that many of us are taking a closer look at US President Joe Biden. And some writers, like our columnist Tim Stanley, are a bit worried about what they're seeing. For Tim, the US president is, a bit doddery, and he could be too old to lead the free world. Tim Stanley, one of the Telegraph's senior leader writers, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Now, Tim, you read an article in the Telegraph this week titled "The Unspoken Truth is that Joe Biden is just too old." Are you being ageist?
Not at all, because I'm not saying that you can't do that job after a certain age. And there are plenty of people out there who have energy and intellectual dynamism. As I said in the piece, Pope Francis is 6 years older, and Donald Trump, who I suspect is going to have another go at running for it, is only 3 years younger. The problem is that in Biden's particular case, I think it's now impossible to pretend that there hasn't been some cognitive decline.
We should say that Biden's 78.
He's 78, that's right. So in his particular case, he just seems tired. I mean, I've been covering American politics for 20 years, and Joe Biden has run for the presidency 3 times, including in 2008. That was the first race that I properly paid attention to. And back then, he really had dynamism. He had energy. That was what defined Joe. He's a motor mouth. And he was a very smart guy on foreign policy in particular at the time. And that, again, that's one of the ironies of the latest crisis. So during the last general election, there was an attempt to suggest that actually Biden was avoiding the limelight because of COVID, and also that he had a stutter. And he does have a stutter. He's always had a stutter. But if you look back to footage, not just from 1987, but 2008, and you look at his behavior then, you don't see the stutter. It's not a stutter problem. It's a problem if you can see the wheels turning in his mind every time he goes off the auto cue, and they're just not working as well as they were.
I think many of us who haven't followed US politics as closely as you have noticed that in all the different press conferences we were seeing him doing in recent days. He does seem to let his mind wander. And yeah, it could be a verbal thing, but he does seem to drift away, doesn't he, from the main topic?
And it has policy implications. What's happened in Afghanistan was always going to happen, because if Donald Trump had won, he himself was committed to withdrawing troops. The question was the way in which America was going to lead. And there's an inflexibility there. There's a refusal to listen to advice. And intriguingly, this is what's really interesting, there's an emotional disconnect, which I think the old Joe Biden wouldn't have got wrong. He won on being an empathetic character, on having more empathy and compassion than Donald Trump. And yet it's really been striking when the Afghanistan crisis began, his inability to judge why it might be seen to have gone wrong, but also his refusal initially to properly articulate sympathy for the people caught up in it. That's someone who's really doggedly fixed on one idea, is not taking advice, and has not got the intellectual flexibility to react to the situation.
That's right. And that empathy is based on the various tragedies he's had in his life, isn't it? That's why people thought they were getting someone who was aware of the human condition and had suffered himself, knew about suffering and cared. That was the point of Biden when he was elected, wasn't it?
That's absolutely correct. He lost his wife and daughter in a tragic car accident. He lost his son, Beau, who many people felt could have been president someday as well. And also his other son, Hunter Biden, is very troubled, has had problems with drugs. So Joe Biden, yes, was the sympathizer in chief. And it was felt after Trump lost that what America was going to get now was a combination of compassion and intelligence. He was going to get a return to normal. Trump was cast by the Democrats as chaotic. You think of the storming of the Congress. That was the last defining image of the Trump years. Biden was supposed to correct that. And yet, with this crisis, you see both a lack of compassion and also you see chaos.
Do you think if Donald Trump had done this, the reaction will be much worse? Do you think the fact it's Joe Biden's done the withdrawal mean that he's had a slight pass on some of the more critical analysis of what he's done?
There's two parts to that. One, I don't think Trump would have done it this way anyway. Trump himself insists that his withdrawal would have been conditional. And there are certain practical decisions that Biden has taken that another president needn't have taken. For instance, the closing of Bagram Air Base. So I suspect the answer to the first part of that is that Trump wouldn't have done that. Had Trump overseen this kind of chaos, definitely he would have been torn apart by the media and by the opposition. But actually, I have to say Biden is getting that as well. People who normally do give him a pass, including broadcasters like CNN, are being very tough on Joe Biden. And that's partly because you just can't ignore the fact that this is a chaotic mistake and a cock-up. But it's also because Americans are very sensitive to perceptions of losing and of being weak. They're sensitive to fellow citizens being trapped abroad, but they also just don't like that sense they're being chased out of town. There should have been a way of doing this that would have meant the Americans would have quietly and orderly left and lowered a flag and played a bugle. And then a few months later, the Taliban would have rolled in. That was the ideal way to play this because they were always going to leave. Instead, this looks like cutting and running as if the Taliban have actually chased the Americans out, which isn't quite correct because Trump signed a peace deal. But that's what it looked like. And even liberal commentators are very angry about this.
You note in your piece that Joe Biden's 78, the Senate Majority Leader is 70, the House Speaker is 81. By my maths, Donald Trump could be around 78 if he runs again for leadership in the next US presidential election. Why does the US go for older leaders? By older, I mean 2 decades older than our current Prime Minister.
I should say that historically it often has done, and particularly in congressional leadership, partly because congressional leadership is based upon seniority, how long you've been around. So the longer you stick around, the better the jobs you get. So it's somewhat baked into the system. It's also partly because there's been a generational change and people are living longer. And people who just couldn't have run for office a few years ago because they wouldn't have been physically able to do it are now able to do it. And also their age can be disguised more effectively. I'm not going to try and second guess what Joe Biden's had done. But he looks from some angles younger than he did 20 years ago. So you can get away with it. But I think there's also just this sense of the exhaustion of the system, that young people are not going into mainstream politics. The boomer generation are clinging on and still dominating the leadership of it. And we're waiting for a generational shift, a generational change. It's got to happen because the United States just looks arthritic at the moment.
But if you look at Kamala Harris, of course, as vice president, I suppose that's the future. And maybe it might be the pressure on our prime minister to have to answer questions once a week in Parliament, this kind of exposure to the opposition, which the US president doesn't really get, does he? I mean, or he or she, they don't get that pressure, do they, from the daily interaction with opposition in the UK?
No, you're absolutely right. It's supposed to be the press that does that, which is why it was so significant that Biden put off his first formal press conference for about 3 months. And others will say presidents generally do delay speaking to the press. That's true. But you think of how extraordinarily accessible Trump was to the press, his willingness to talk to them. An American president, almost any of them, couldn't take what Boris Johnson goes through every week in Parliament. And that parliamentary scrutiny really keeps people on their toes and probably also leads to burnout. But don't forget also, the Prime Minister ultimately is the Prime Minister, the first among the Queen's ministers. The President is something different. The position has a certain sacramental quality to it almost. It's supposed to be above the fray or give the impression of being above the fray. So you almost wouldn't want to put a president through that. But when you do, you want to be able to do so trusting that he can handle it and that if he can take the heat in the kitchen. It just reinforces the sense of losing control in Afghanistan to see a president who clearly can't respond to those questions, doesn't have the acuity to do it. That's very troubling.
Tim Stanley, the Telegraph columnist and lead writer, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you, Tim.
It's a pleasure.
And links to Tim's piece and the very moving piece by Dominic Nicholls will both be in the show notes of this episode. Well, that's all for this week, listeners. Thank you to my guest this week, the formidable Sasha Swire, and the Telegraph's own Dominic Nicholls, Lucy Fisher, and of course, Tim Stanley. If you want to read more brilliant analysis by Dom, Lucy, or Tim, please do become a Telegraph subscriber. Please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper and get 1 month completely free of charge, and then the next 2 months for just 50p per month. What a bargain. And I'd love to hear what you've got to say about today's topics. Do let me know. Email me, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or find me on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. And thank you as well to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, Giles Gear, and Theo Luludis. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this show. It really helps other people find us. And finally, of course, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, though, cheerio!